So in the previous video, we've seen how to access Simcenter Testlab Desktop Advanced through the UTS WorkSpace as an example. It's sometimes possible if you're working on university systems for you to access this software from the client, but for those of you working from home or on your own devices, UTS WorkSpace is a great way to be able to access many different engineering applications, including MATLAB, as I say, Simcenter. Let's say, for example, that you've been provided with a file. You may have accessed it from the canvas, for example, as part of a tutorial exercise. Here's such a file that's been made available in a subject. So we're going to hit that guy, and that's going to download to our downloads folder, which you can see here. And so remember that in UTS WorkSpace, it's really important to make use of the file storage available through the OneDrive. So I'm just going to move that to this side, and then I will get my downloads folder over here. So here's my recently downloaded file. So I'm going to put that over here in my folder that I've created within my OneDrive. Double click here, you can see that's there. I'm just going to move it into this folder. And here you can see I previously did that. So if I unzip this folder here, then it will result in a folder and a project file for Simcenter Testlab. In fact, what it's done is create a new folder with the same name as the zip file. So in here, we've got exactly the same two files as I've got up here in this level here. So I can remove these two because that's just duplicating what I have already here. So if I go back to Simcenter from UTS WorkSpace, you've already got this loaded. Remember, hit this drop down, go to my OneDrive, search for the folder that I've created to work on these projects. And here's the project file, which is a .lms and an associated folder. Within the folder, for each of the sections within the project, and we'll learn more about sections as the subject progresses, I have within here some more folders, and inside of those folders, although we can't see them at the moment because we're searching for this type of a file and there isn't that type of a file in there. There is a file in there, but it is essentially a different type of file. So if you have a look at what's inside of here, it's an LDSF file. Essentially, it's the time data that's been recorded when this project was made. So that's what's inside that file. Let's just open this file and have a look at the project file. I can explain then in more detail. So I get this warning every time. I can check this box if it's starting to get annoying. But to be honest, it doesn't bother me too much these days. So it's opening this project. And here within the project has this title. You can see there are these three sections. And within each of these sections, there are some data, some different runs. If I can expand these, you can see some functions that have been created when I've collected these data. More about that in the future of this subject. And as I've referred to this time data file, which is just simply called throughput data. And within that file, there are these three channels, channel 1, channel 2, and channel 3. What I should normally do is change section up here. Okay, so I've got various sections in here. If I'm working in the uncalibrated section, that's this section. I've collected some data from 3 sensors prior to properly specifying the actual sensitivity of those sensors. And I collected some data, and the exercise that we will work through is making use of these data and comparing the measurements that have been made with the actual vibration velocity to determine the proper actual sensitivities for these 3 channels, or at least 2 of these 3 channels. Some things that I can do in Simcenter to have a look at these data, for example, would be to open a front-back display, and I can then use a right-click on here to make this front-back display present data in preview mode. We get this little magnifying glass up here. It means that anything I select in this list here will essentially be previewed, and you can see as I click through these different files, what's displayed is changing. You should note that in preview mode, the back axis is used for the unit system, and for time data, we should always change from amplitude to real. Then you can see the extent of the full extent of the time waveform between the lowest value, 0 is in the middle. This happens to be minus 700 times 10 to the minus 6g to plus 700 times 10 to the minus 6g. It looks just like a lot of data. Bear in mind, there's 41 seconds of data here. This is 159.2 hertz sinusoidal waveform. If I just have a look at 1 second of these data instead of a full 41 seconds, you can start to see something that is getting closer to looking like a sine wave. It's slightly undersampled, and there'll be more about that in previous weeks, but there is an underlying sinusoid here of a single frequency. Okay, so that's some tips and tricks on how to use Simcenter, and we'll use Simcenter in more detail in the future. This video is primarily about exporting these data to some other type of file format. I want to be able to use MATLAB. We know how to use MATLAB for the processing of these kinds of data sets. I want to be able to perhaps also export to a text file. Before we go ahead and do that, let's have a look at these data again. Let's right click on here and have a look at the properties. I know, because I collected these data, that these data have been collected with a sample frequency, and that's again something for the future, of 512 hertz. That means 512 samples per second. Remember, I said that this was 159.2 hertz sinusoid. This particular transducer, these data were collected with a sensitivity of 99.43 millivolts per G, a provisional sensitivity. And so there are some things in the properties file within Simcenter on these time data that are interesting for us to be able to interrogate. We might, when we export these data to another, or to a file format that we can use to review these data in a different application, lose some of these pieces of information. But I'll show you what happens when we export to a text file and when we export directly to a MATLAB file. So we can either export one at a time, these channels, these various channels, so we can export, for example, to MATLAB or to a text, or we can go here and right click and export all 3 files. When I export to MATLAB here, I have some options. I'm going to go up to the folder where these data were collected. So remember, we're in the uncalibrated section. It's run 1, and some options exist for me down here. Now I can either group similar blocks in a matrix by checking this off, or I can checking this on, or I can turn this one off. What that means is these two C2 and C3 channels are accelerometer channels. Channel 1 is a laser vibrometer channel. This is a velocity measurement. These two are acceleration measurements. So if I check this one on, I'll end up with these 2 acceleration measurements grouped together. I'm actually going to turn that one off because I'd like to just see each of these 3 channels individually exported, and rather than being collected together. So that's my export. I will give it a name of uncalibrated. So that's the section name. Run 1, that's the run name. It's time, these are time data, and the date that they were collected on is the 3rd of the 2nd. You can see that there's already a file in there, so this will probably give me a warning. Do I want to overwrite it? Yes or no? Yes, that's fine. I'll overwrite it. I'm going to repeat that process to export this to a text file. A text file can be opened in something like Microsoft Excel. Same process. Okay, I happen to have now, the easiest way to get the file name is to go into that folder where I previously saved these data. Are they here somewhere? I don't see them immediately. Perhaps it's still exporting them. There it is. Okay, it takes a while to export that. It's a lot of data. It's 41 seconds of data at 512 hertz with 3 channels. If I rename this one, Control Copy, so I can copy that, go back to Testlab, copy and paste here, okay, and save. And it's going to give it an extension .txt. You'll notice that there's some folder structure within Testlab. I can actually browse through the folders here within my computer, through my users area, into my Ben Holken folder, and there's my OneDrive. There's my folder where I'm working from presently. If I drill in here, eventually you can see that I find these data, and it's associated the MATLAB file with MATLAB and gives me a MATLAB icon. Here's the text file that I've just created. We'll see exactly the same thing. if I open Windows Explorer, here's the map file, here's the text file that have just been created. If I view with details, you can see timestamps that coincide with the moment in time today. Be aware that this workspace here is a Simcenter workspace rather than UTS WorkSpace, and there are some other areas within Simcenter. For example, an input basket that we'll come back to at some point in the future.